Are you an early stage founder revolutionizing the future of retail? Then you're in the right place. My name is Shah, and I'm an angel investor investing at the pre-seed stage in retail tech, e-commerce, and digitally native brands. I'm also the founder of Retail X Series, an in-real-life event series based in New York to help early-stage founders think through topics like customer acquisition, sales pipelines, branding, financial modeling, fundraising, and more. In this podcast, I interview founders and investors who've spoken at Retail X Series events in the past, and we dig deep into the tactics around key topics that early-stage founders want to hear about. Welcome to the Retail X podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Retail X Series podcast. I'm your host, Sapna Shah. Today's episode is all about early DTC customer acquisition before you've raised a large round of funding. Our guest today, Elana Reinholtz, founder and CEO of Bird & Stone, will share her experiences and advice about how she found those early customers that helped build revenues right from the company's launch. Welcome to the podcast, Elana.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm excited to have you. So let's start with some background. So can you tell us a little bit about your personal background and your company and what it does?
Sure. So I think it's interesting how most people start D2C businesses. Were probably a mix of, what your personal interest and your background is. I have no background in anything related to e-commerce or marketing. I worked in the financial services sector at Bloomberg, but that experience actually working in financial services and honing my chops in finance actually gave me the push to volunteer and to want to use my skills for good and to give back. And that was kind of the beginning of my company. So I definitely think it was an important part of my journey. When I was working at Bloomberg and I was 24, I looked for a place to volunteer, and I ended up doing a skills-based volunteering program in Kenya. They're called Village Volunteers, and I kind of worked right in with a group of women, widowed women that were, 40, 50 years old, bringing their families out of poverty with 3 microloans. After a few $200 microloans, women were starting businesses, and they were buying cows or buying grain, initial investments, and I was helping with accounting and financial classes. So that's really the beginning of the Bird & Stone story, because it starts with a volunteer mission of its own. I fundraised for the trip to Kenya by making my own jewelry. I didn't know how to make jewelry, but I knew I needed a couple $1,000 to get to Kenya. I taught myself how to make jewelry on YouTube, an affordable price point, $25. I ended up walking around the trading floor and just selling bracelets to my friends and colleagues during a holiday season before my trip. And that was really one of the first testing grounds. If you think about Kickstarter, I did an in-person Kickstarter with my friends, and I said, I'd make whatever you want. I custom made things. I talked to my customers on the ground, and I went on my trip. And that trip was the beginning of an awakening of saying these women were working so hard, and they didn't have the same privilege being in a country that didn't really concentrate on women's legal rights the same way. And they were working really hard. And I was like, I want to support these women. I think this would be a local program, but how can we support with this model? So when I came back, I started Bird & Stone, which means 2 birds with 1 stone. You could buy some really gorgeous jewelry that you could wear every day and have a message. It can inspire you on maybe you're working on fighting climate change and that's your campaign, or maybe you're getting more women to run for office, or maybe you're mentoring young women, but then every purchase goes to a cause. And so our first cause was this group of women entrepreneurs in Kenya. And that's really how it started, how we became a conscious business.
That's an amazing story. By the way, I'm totally going to get back to that in-person thing, but a little bit later in the podcast. Mm-hmm. So how long ago was that? How long have you been in business?
That was about 7 years ago, but we've really been at it. And since I quit my full-time job, it's been about, 5 years.
And so you strapped for a long time, and then you raised some outside capital. Is that right? When was that?
Yeah, we were bootstrapped all the way up until this past fall. So we had, we had people, we had a team of people that we were just paying from our sales. We were doing the things we needed to do to make money. And I think that focus is really good, because you're really focused on not wasting anything. But also that, becomes limiting at a point when you want to do longer term investments in things outside of just sales driving. But that's how we started. So the first time we raised outside capital was this past fall. I wanted to be really careful about how we raised capital. The time I was raising in the past year was the first time the consciousness around, growth above all else was really coming into play. And I kind of felt that before, which is if we go the way of, equity investment and growing to eventually sell, we could, as a conscious first, as a values first company, lose part of our DNA, which is every product gives 10%. We have a really strong impact strategy in ethical manufacturing. So it was really important for us to think about what partners we wanted to work with. And one that I'll mention, which was part of our round, is really in the alternative finance, which is a non-equity partner. They're called Rev Up Fund. They're out of Rhode Island, and they're an accelerator for growing direct-to-consumer and SaaS companies. And they really incubate you and are strategic investors as well. And so they've been great. So they win if you grow. They don't own any equity. Kind of a win-win for us. So we're really happy about that. And that's going to be like a 4-year partnership. And then the other thing I'll mention is that there's a really cool program out of New York City, which not many people know about, that an angel investor actually talked to me about when I was going down the angel round, which I never ended up saying that was for us. And we talked to We NYC, which is Women Entrepreneurship NYC. And it's a program with a lot of initiatives around getting more women funded and just more women businesses started. So a part of it called We Fund, the city helped connect us to some local lending institutions. And we did a debt round as well with a community lending bank.
That's amazing. And those are great resources that I'm sure most people don't know about. So thank you for sharing them.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's rewind a little bit. So let's talk about the earliest stages of your company. So in those original days, you were kind of, you knew there was something there because you had made some jewelry and funded your trip to Kenya. And then you came back and clearly there was something that you wanted to pursue here in the jewelry space. How did you start building that first customer base and get the word out? Did you start with kind of wait lists or pre-orders? Like how did you really get those first customers kind of once you decided that this is a business that you wanted to really focus on?
Yeah, so I think before I even created a website, I actually had an Etsy shop. And so that was giving me initial insights. And it was just really a scrappy way to launch products. I think a lot of us, and if people are listening now who are incubating a product over a few years, I really just say concentrate on sales first. And just starting a scrappy form of that in some way is good because that's real traction. Instead of, it's really hard to forecast your costs too if you're really not understanding what you can make on a monthly basis. So we started with Etsy. I also, in the first couple of years, took my own luggage and went to every craft fair I could possibly go to in the New York City area. I went to Jersey City, Brooklyn, Harlem, everywhere, and talked to a lot of customers. And I physically was understanding the difference between zip codes and like affordability and wealth and where people lived and where our customer was. And if our customer was maybe socially conscious, like where could we reach that? That was, our first theory is how do we reach socially conscious consumers? So I really just did a lot of testing on the ground at that point, talking to customers. And that's something that you really lose until you go to a retail store, which is that in-person communication. So I was having really long form communication with customers about what they did for a living. What were they doing on the weekend? I mean, this is stuff that you wish you got, right, from a product insight survey. So that point I think that part was really important part of our journey.
And how long was it kind of before you went sort of from the Etsy model to your own website?
Oh yeah, it was pretty quickly. I mean, we were working on it, in tandem. The second we really incorporated and turned it into a business. Before it was very much a testing platform. It was actually called Beads for Kenya on Etsy. So that was really like a pre-company stage.
It's interesting because, I've not ever talked to another entrepreneur who has used, another platform like an Etsy to kind of kick off. I think everyone feels like you need to have your own store up first, but it makes so much sense to, do that in tandem and really start testing things out as quickly as possible. So I think that it's a really interesting strategy that clearly was helpful for you
Mhm.
to as well to learn about your customers. Tell me a little bit more about how, you alluded to some of this, but how did you do that research on your early customers? Like what were you trying to
Yeah.
get out of them, and were they willing to talk to you about these things?
Yeah, so I would say the first 100 customers, which is, outside of my friends and friends of friends, some of the early customers we got through Mashable and gift guides, I just looked at all of their, social media information, all the things that are online that I could look at, I would look at. And that's not really scalable. But these are the things about, demographic and psychographic things to figure out your target market for when you do start doing advertising. And I would really recommend that really early is understanding your customer like a friend at first. And then I would say I never really stopped asking deeper questions from our customer. So now we do a lot of advertising on Facebook, and there's questions from me. Someone may comment about asking for a product in sterling silver. We recently rolled out a whole other higher price point because of a question someone asked, and I just kept going further. What would you like to see in it? Does anyone else want to see this in sterling silver? And we just got 50 replies of people who also wanted it. And I think that's really interesting, the direct customer service that can happen on a platform like Facebook. And then about the questions and the answers that can happen quickly on Facebook or email is that a customer might say, I love your product. I bought 4 of them for the women in my family this holiday. Well, that's a really interesting nugget, but it's just the tip of it. And so I'll ask further, oh, tell me about it. Do you have a photo? Randomly, I asked this yesterday and someone wrote back and said, here's a photo of my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, and me. We're all wearing your bracelets. I'm so glad that we're all fighting for this cause. Someone in our family is fighting for this cause at the same time. And I was like, wow, if I had never engaged, in a really casual way, we would never have gotten that back. And there's so many more insights that I think are hidden in our customers, and just giving more opportunities for them to offer them. And whether that's through Instagram or email or Facebook, wherever they're most comfortable.
Yeah, first of all, I just got chills when you said that whole part about the photo. That's amazing.
Hmm.
So interesting that you're kind of 7 years into this journey and you're still talking to your customers in such a one-on-one way, which I know is, not scalable, and you can't do that with every customer. But to get those insights, even at this
Mm-hmm.
in your evolution as a company, it just seems so valuable. And, I don't know if a lot of other companies in your position are still able to have that one-on-one customer interaction as they grow. So I think that is it's just such a good lesson that,
Mm-hmm.
at least in some way, it's still doable even as you get bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I think it's like hitting the front line too. Like I think at Burger King, even when the new CEO started, I think a few years ago, they went on the front line to the retail store and like made burgers. And I think that's like it for me. I don't do that a lot, but when I'm out of it, when I haven't done it for 3 months, I'm like, I should do this for an hour. So I do think that there's like a middle ground of a goal, a personal goal of doing this for like an hour a month and just engaging with customers. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'm sure incredibly valuable. So, kind of going back to kind of those earliest days again, I keep trying to turn, we keep
Mhm.
getting later, but I want to go back to kind of the beginning days. A lot of founders in DTC for DTC businesses really think that crowdfunding is something that they should consider. Is it something that you considered before you launched?
It definitely has a place. I think just because we did it in a different way, we kind of already existed as a company in a low grade way just for a longer amount of time. Our pre launch was essentially launching our first product, which was a product market fit, which was the Futures Female Cuff. We had previously had beaded products that were supporting our poverty cause area. I mentioned that story in Kenya, and girls' education. So this was our really first partnership with a big nonprofit. We launched with Planned Parenthood of New York City. It was the Women's March. It was January of 2017. And we had launched a new product doing, questions and answers in groups of people I was in, like, would you buy this? And then we launched the Futures Female in limited quantities, in limited pre-runs. And we would let them, we would run out, and then we had to quickly learn how to make them at scale. So I definitely think that there's a place and a time for crowdfunding, and it's a form of market validation. I would also say that there's a lot of market validation even before sales, which is like if your hypothesis about a product is right, the sales is the end of that. And before that, you can get a lot of things from focus groups and interviewing. So if you're about to launch, I would say this, I have a friend who is about to launch, this is the coolest thing, a bracelet tote. And it is a reusable tote that's on your wrist. It wraps into a bracelet. And he's about to launch with the plastic bag ban, about to go into New York City in the next couple months. And he has a group of 200 people who know that they want a plastic bag. They know a reusable bag, that they want to have a more waste-free, more sustainable life. Before he even sells that, there's all these people who are just ready to give feedback around it to make sure that Kickstarter is really successful once you put those resources towards it.
Amazing. I think I might need to talk to you after this about that bag thing.
Cool.
Feels very cool.
Can't wait. We're going to get you one.
Perfect. So you've talked a little bit about some of the things you did at the very earliest stages. As you started growing and you had this first bracelet and then you had other products that came out, what channels were kind of the most successful for you from a marketing perspective when you didn't have a lot of money to spend on Facebook yet, or when you didn't have a lot of, ad money yet as revenues were still, ramping up?
I would definitely say there's a specific example around partnerships, and kind of it's probably easy to think that if you're going to put some effort, let's say behind an email, and we did a female founded email around us telling our customers about other female founded brands out there, it almost seems like at odds with like promoting your message. But for us, if our message is that we want more impact oriented brands out there, we want more customers thinking about shifting their money from these traditional brands, right, to more female founded, impact oriented, triple bottom line brands, then we want you to know there's a lot more out like us. So one of the things we actually did around Earth Day in the beginning was we put a small amount of budget, right, and got one of those softwares. I think it's called Dojo Mojo. It might still be around. And we hosted the software, and allows you to get a lot of brands on it, and it automates everything for you. It automates getting, the emails, turning them into the flows, connecting to your email, things like that. But we put time and energy into making these assets and having an Earth Day, and where we told our customer base about like 4 other sustainable brands. And the engagement we got from people about, that was the campaign where people stayed on our new emails. They stayed on our list for a long time. They were really engaged, and our current customers emailed us and said, thanks so much for telling us about these brands. So I think just in terms of partnerships, it's been a really great way for us to grow and to grow the pie larger with other small brands that are really innovative, and they're really down to do like scrappy partnerships.
That's so interesting. And then there came a point, and you alluded to this earlier, that you did have a little bit more money to spend, and Facebook has been sort of interesting for you and has worked for you. Can you talk a little bit about how Facebook has worked for you, kind of what has worked and what hasn't worked on kind of paid advertising, particularly since those early days?
Yes. And I think it's particularly important to mention how Facebook changes really quickly for such a huge system across. There's been a few phases. So there was like pre-us, which is like pre-2017, where brands like us talk about how easy it was to acquire, right? Mm-hmm. Customers on Facebook for a few bucks on the average order, which is a really low CPA. We launched around one product. So when we launched with Facebook, we were sending people right to the product page. There was also some tests around a video. I mean, I did a video on my couch and I talked about this fundraiser we were going to do, and it got a lot of engagement. So we tested different things. We tested product pages. We tried out our own landing pages at the time. Now there's a really cool tool called Shogun that if you're using Shopify, I would really recommend. Shogun allows you to do it without any developer resources, and you can kind of just like drag and drop, kind of like you can do on a Squarespace or Shopify, and you could play around with your landing pages. And with that, there's a lot of things that brands do, that small brands do, that we don't really know why things aren't working. It's really easy to say that didn't work. But another tool that's really great is a heat mapping tool. You can use Hotjar, but there's a lot of other ones. And you could understand where people are dropping off, what part of their message they're getting, and what part you're just wasting your dollars on getting someone to your site. So I think drilling down and understanding and doing these tests in these like little laboratories is really important. And then I think for us, what really didn't work, an example is we really didn't do Google in the beginning. I think that certain companies have a problem they're trying to solve. Maybe it's like eye fatigue, right? And Felix Gray, who was on the panel with us, and people are searching that. And if you have intent around a product, that's great. But if you don't have intent around a problem you're solving, but rather a benefit, or you're a fashion brand, Google really didn't work for us in the beginning. That is something we're now re-exploring and expanding. But at the time, that's something that didn't work for us.
Thanks. And that was so helpful that you mentioned these tools. I think you've actually mentioned more specific tools and programs, I think, than any other podcast interview we have had to date. So I appreciate that. I think all of these things are great resources for our listening audience. You found, as you started growing this company, that your customer was maybe a little different than you had originally hypothesized that she would be. Can you tell us about how that realization came out and how you really understood that this segment maybe was not exactly who you had originally thought it might be?
Yes, I think this is one of the craziest things when I pitched and would talk to investors who are also typically, over 55. I think what's really interesting is most millennials running e-commerce companies do not have customers that are baby boomers. But for us, that is our biggest demographic. So I had assumed that we would be starting a company for people our age, maybe 25 to 45-year-old women. And there are those customers are out there. They engage with us more around Instagram and in different social channels, and they buy in holidays. What's really interesting, and maybe it can also touch on inequality and certain places of kind of the U shape, which is like there's more higher end job growth and lower end job growth, is we're really seeing this discretionary income happening at the top of the income scale. And so baby boomers for us just helped our business model to thrive and to stay in business in the beginning when we didn't have funding. They were buying 4, 5, 6, 8 Futures female cuffs. They were giving them out to their daughters and their kids' nannies and teachers, whereas the millennial was, buying 1 or 2. So I think as a brand, we want to be talking to all of them. But that was the really big insight, is that our audience is majority over 50. So that's, over 55% over 50. She is really highly educated. We learned that she's 3 times more likely to have a master's degree than the average American. And she's really socially conscious, which we probably already knew. And she's politically active. And I think that there's another interesting tool I'll just mention is when you get to a critical mass of Facebook advertising, you can actually go on the back end of your page and go to Facebook Insights, and it gives you all this information about the people who like your page and who are probably buying from you. And so we learned about like the top 100 pages that people like, and we really understood in a granular and in a methodical way what pages people liked, what TV they watched, what books they read, things like that, which could really inform the way that we reach out to partners. It really informed for us, right? Because we have a 2-part recipe, which is an inspiring product, but it's a matching nonprofit with each product launch. So it informed the secondary thing too. There's a list that says, listen, our customers are really into gun safety. So, okay, let's launch something around that. We're about to do that. Our customers are really into supporting refugees. Okay, let's make sure we have a partnership for that. So yeah, I think that's a really cool tool, and it's really helped us expand to a wider range of causes. And I'll mention that we started with a lot of women's health causes. If you notice, like in the beginning, girls' education, women's health. It's really the feminism, which has been a strong trend. But from these insights, we've also launched into environmental protection, and we're working with Amazon Watch, which is working to support the Amazon rainforest with indigenous partnerships. And we work with a local refugee organization too, which is actually in Brooklyn. So if you care about any of those issues, you may have another reason to check out Burn Stone now.
What is really interesting here is that there's like a really common thread through everything we've talked about so far, which is that this customer understanding has been really critical to how you market, the partnerships you're going after, the product you make. I mean, it really feels like everything you've done has been kind of customer first since the earliest kind of moments in your company through till today. And I think that's a really interesting perspective and an interesting lesson, because I think a lot of times when we have these kinds of conversations, and certainly when I do with entrepreneurs, the conversation is very tactical, and it's like, I have 37 cohort segments, and I'm going to look at this segment like this and this segment like this, and it's very formatted and rote, and you have a different level of understanding of your customer and what they want from you, and you've spent so much time researching them.
Yeah, I've actually been thinking about that, and where I think there's strengths of a founder, and if you come from a growth marketing background or financial analytical background, right? I think the second one, we have a lot of e-commerce founders who come from a analytical background. You're going to enjoy playing in that space. If you're not coming from a sales or product development, it might be hard to talk to customers, and that may not be where you're comfortable. And I think that both are important, but I think that if you start with the analytical and running the cohorts and modeling, then it's really hard to then learn about customers after. And I think it's easier to do the customers first and then layer on those analytics in order to scale.
Yeah, that's really great advice. And I think, particularly for like the Retail X audience, this is an audience that generally is a little earlier stage, where it should be honestly easier to talk to the customers than to run the analytics, because you just don't have that much information yet.
Right.
So good advice for everybody who's listening today.
Yeah. Before you check your analytics, go email a customer. That's what I would say. Before you log into GA, email a couple of customers. That's the homework.
Okay. So I just want to turn quickly to we talked a little bit about Facebook and some of the other acquisition channels that you used. I know you've had some experience using PR agencies and PR in general. You even alluded to sort of Mashable and gift guides at the earliest kind of stages of your company. How has press worked for you? This is a really controversial topic with early stage founders. Should you hire somebody to do press? Does press even work? Should you do it yourself? Can you tell us a little bit more about how you thought about press over the last few years?
Yeah, so around PR, I think that I'm probably not in the controversial part. I'm definitely in the middle of hot and cold, which is we've done a lot of DIY PR. We've also done a couple external PR agencies and publicists, and I think we haven't been wowed and knocked out of the park. And so where we are, we haven't gone all in, and that's really hard for an early stage company to do, right? It's really hard for even as a person to give a big piece of your budget to something that cannot tell you the return on your spend. So that was really hard for us in the beginning. We did it ourselves. We focused on gift guides, which were a great ROI for us. And then we're just looking into moving into the right agency soon, probably in the next year. I know that a lot of other people may have stronger feelings, but I think that's us. And I'll add one more thing, is that doing it yourself before delegating is great in terms of understanding how hard it is to get press and how many emails journalists get a day. I didn't really get that until I researched how to reach a journalist and to understand. I think journalists are much harder actually to reach than influencers. I think about, you're just going to everyone has a list of priorities, right? Imagine if you're doing your job and someone just sends you, from like a salesperson from a tech company who's trying to sell your brand. It's not really on your list of priorities. So it's really hard to get to the top of the list of a journalist. And so if you're a really storytelling or content focused person, I would probably recommend you try it. If not, you may want some help from someone who's a friend. I know that, I had a really good friend, Michelle Sukanik, who would help me out, and she would help me with exports in the beginning from her PR database that these PR agencies pay for. Really expensive databases, and they keep track of journalists and where they are and where they work. So I had a lot of help, and I learned that we were good at it, but not good enough. So we'll be looking at changing that in the future.
You mentioned influencers. How about influencers? Have you used influencers, and has that been successful?
Yeah, I think we've had some really interesting success around influencers. So I wanted to talk that we've used influencers, but not in a paid way where we probably talk about influencers. We really tried a few different things. We tried the micro influencers, which work, right? It's like a scaled version of a friend of yours talking about a brand. The middle and the higher end paid influencers really didn't work for us. We really didn't find the message resonating, and we couldn't stand out from the noise in the fashion world. So we took that learning And I really I think about this on a daily basis, which is ask yourself what you can do for your celebrity, not what your celebrity can do for you. And so I thought about it and I contacted Taya Leone, who is the star of a show called Madam Secretary. So I don't know if you watch it or you've heard of it, but it's on CBS. It's on Sunday night, and it features a woman who is the Secretary of State. And she's just a really cool example of a awesome woman and a family woman, right? Who leaves her kitchen in the morning and her husband's there with the kids, and she goes to make change in the world. And that is I had no idea, but our customers were exactly in alignment with the people watching that show. And I just liked that show. So I tweeted at her and I said, hey, I think you really like our Features Female cuff. I noticed that you had interest in like Planned Parenthood. And she ended up wearing it, saying yes. And then she kept wearing it. She wore it to the Women's March. So I think that's a really interesting way to think about where people's priorities are and fitting in. And instead of, it's really a way of like being self-absorbed or not, and how you can help someone else. So that's one example.
That's an interesting strategy. That's so amazing that worked.
I think it's growth hacking PR, probably. Yeah.
I love it. I mean, that it makes so much sense when you say it that way. Like, what can you do for them? Perfect. And where's the fit? I love it. Like, again, knowing your customer is really helpful on this front, right? I know you have your website. Have you ever considered kind of doing wholesale or kind of offline models, like a neighborhood goods or show fields, having your own stores? Have you done anything like that? Are you thinking about doing anything like that? Do you think that would be something that would make sense for your customer and your strategy?
Yeah, I think a lot about the evolution of the role of wholesale and retail. There was really a pullback in the industry in the last few years of direct to consumer. Not having rent is a good thing, right? Not having to go through a middleman is a good thing, and speaking directly to your customer. That was really like the last 3 years in this cycle. And now I feel it coming around along with this trend of shopping local and actually lowering your carbon footprint and not buying online. Right. So it's a really confusing time to be figuring out as a founder of a small brand. We do some wholesale if there are places that have a really, for us, we look for a match of our values, and maybe they're curating female founded brands or something like that. We've definitely there's a store called Bulletin, which is all about storytelling, female founded brands. And it's a store that keeps changing. And that's in Soho, I think, and in Williamsburg, if you've been there. And in terms of like an actual retail space, we're having fun imagining what that would look like. For us, we really think about the purchase being the first step of a conscious buying cycle. And if we had a store, how could we help our customers who are women running for office? They're lawyers, they're nurses, they're local leaders, they work in nonprofits. Like, how could we help them live their lives better? When we think about our customers, our end users, we want to empower them in addition to our nonprofit partners. So I think it'd be really cool to be, showcasing a nonprofit or have a panel. And I think those things can only happen if we had our own community space. So keep your eye out for that.
That sounds exciting. And I love the thought process behind, what you would do with the space. I think that could be really interesting. And you'll have to keep us posted when you get to that point.
I will. Yeah.
So now shifting a little bit to kind of metrics. So you raced around, and it was maybe with a little bit more of an alternative financing type round. But, what metrics were really important for you as you were thinking about going out and raising any sort of money? I mean, investors always ask about customer acquisition cost and lifetime value, but were there other things that were really important for you that you had to kind of shift on metrics as you got to the point of raising money?
Yeah, that's great. I think apart from just e-commerce metrics, there's business metrics. I really got asked a lot from investors about our gross margins because we make our items in the US. So I think if you're a manufacturing company thinking about, does your business work from a unit economic standpoint in terms of gross margins? And if they're really high for the jewelry category rather than like, let's say clothing, which has a lot more, steps in between making your first dress because of how complicated it is than like a bracelet. I think that looked really positive for investors on us. And then if you have a higher, gross margin, you have more advertising dollars to play with on each average order. So I think they really come into play with thinking about how your gross margins work with your average order. and understanding how long you're going to spend to recoup that. I mean, for us, we really want to recoup our advertising spend in 2 purchases or less. And our average order is around like $50 to $70, depending on the season. So that's someone buying like 2 cuffs from us. And that's what our average order looks like. So we really kept an eye on, to add to your question, you mentioned CAC and LTV for the lifetime value of the customer. We really keep track of average order. And I would also look at a lot of things around product launching. That's been really interesting for us to look at. Are you getting new customers? Are you getting return customers from product launch? And how much of your sales are coming from those new products, so you can understand like your efficiency of your R&D time. And then what are your return customers buying? What are they engaging with? And how big is their AOV? So I think we've seen our return customers, they were a very small part in the beginning, and that, really starts a big ramp as you're around for a few years in your advertising. And that really, it happens when you build out engagement channels. So our return customers are really engaging on email, and that's really informed our other marketing channels. So I know we didn't talk about that, but that's definitely a priority in terms of where we're moving towards. You saw the whole Casper thing come out, right? With like a majority of their money being spent on advertising. And I think we've been careful about that from the beginning to avoid that problem. But being mindful of that, say, use your email channel. That is just like the most effective of a like CAC kind of channel that there is. So right now.
Yeah. So if that's the most effective, what's the one thing that you've tried, that, you mentioned Google AdWords actually, but is there anything else that you've tried for customer acquisition that really just continues not to work for you?
Yeah, we tried doing the whole scrappy pre-selling thing again when we were a little bit more established, and it really didn't work. And I think what's interesting is we were launching a new collection that we were excited about, a new cause around women in politics. And we had this great phrase. It was "Who Run the World," right, from Beyonce's song. And it was going to be like, oh, women are running for office. And it's a really cool phrase. We tried to pre-sell it, and it totally failed. And we created all of these processes around putting it up and getting like lead gen campaigns. And what we saw was like, let's get our insights earlier instead of waiting for the sales. We really moved the market validation in our process earlier, up until like asking our customers in Instagram polls, would you buy this? Instead of waiting all the way to the end to see if something would work or would sell. So I think that's something we learned. If people are confused about when to launch products and how to, I think the more market validation you can do with your audience, more focus groups and interviews you can do, you'll save yourself a lot of money and time.
That's really interesting. And again, going back to knowing your customer really well and getting that validation from them just by asking them, which makes sense. All right, so I want to wrap up with one last question, which is if you could give one piece of advice, and by the way, you've given them about 1 million pieces of advice so far, so let me just be clear that thank you already for all the other advice. But if you could give one piece of advice to the founders kind of in our listening audience about customer acquisition at those early stages, what would that advice be?
I think customer acquisition at the early point, you're really like a freshman in college to me. If you haven't worked in growth marketing, you're really in a place to absorb a lot. So I would say keep an open mind and self-teach yourself as much as you can, because you'll probably hand it over to some sort of marketing or growth marketing agency, and you'll never be able to retake that. So there's a lot of knowledge there. And I would also say in a personal way is that people are going to say a lot of things, and you're going to be really confused on which channels to go to, and listen to your gut. There's totally times to listen to experts and listen to people that have been where you want to go. But there's just going to be a lot of people at the beginning of your company that talk to you at parties or in, or at a coffee shop and have opinions. And I think I learned too late, like just how strong I should listen to my inner voice and my gut, because no one knows your company better than you do. And don't forget that.
That is great advice. Elana, thank you so much for sharing your stories, your experience, all this advice, and all these resources as well on the podcast today. I very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a blast. Thanks for having me.
And to the audience, thank you for listening to the Retail X podcast. We'll have another episode out shortly. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to attend a Retail X series event in person, Check out www.retailxseries.com for upcoming events in New York. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at RetailXSeries. You can also learn more about me, find fundraising resources, or submit a pitch deck at www.redgiraffeadvisors.com. Thanks, and catch you next time.